There's a story about a man named Joe from downtown. He worked in a nice office building, had a nice job, had a nice chair at his desk, had a nice family, had 3 nice kids, had a nice house, paid his taxes, was a good guy. Joe was also a religious guy. He'd go to church every single week, loved taking care of the poor, loved doing extracurricular church activities. You know, all the ones that nobody else wants to show up to, he's the one who showed up. And the thing about Joe is he wanted to share his faith really bad with a guy named Emmet who he had worked with for 3 years. But there's something you should know about Joe. Joe had a 3-foot bird sitting on his shoulder. And it was not just any bird. It was the ugliest bird you have ever seen in your entire life. It had a rock for a beak. It looked like one of those misshapen potatoes you get at the bottom of the bag. And it opened only to insult Joe. Yell at Joe. Not whisper, but insult. This thing's 3 foot tall, rock for a beak, yellow eyes, black, matted, dirty feathers. And it insulted Joe like crazy. But Joe really wanted to talk to Emmet about his faith and about his religious experiences. And one day, Joe got enough courage to do just that. He walked over to Emmet, who he has known for 3 years. They've spent loads of time together, both in and out of work. And as he went up to Joe, the bird became more and more and more insulting, talking about his mom. I mean, it was awful. It was really, really insulting. But he overcame for just a moment to say, Emmet, I would love for you to come to dinner at my house. Would you be able to come tonight at 6, an hour after work? Emmet said yes, and Joe said good, and he ran away. He actually left work early. He was so stressed out, and this bird just kept yelling at him. This bird had been there for years, and here's the crazy part. Emmet was about to come over to his house, but you have to know a few things about Joe's house, okay? So Emmet shows up, knocks on the door. Joe opens the door with the bird on his shoulder, still insulting him, and just as Joe opened the door, there was a 1-foot little ogre that ran up and started kicking Emmet in the shins, started kicking him, literally kicking him in the shins. Well, obviously Joe is freaking out, embarrassed, grabs the little ogre, says, come on in, it's good, come in. Takes the little ogre, sets him in a little chair that I guess he had made for him, because this has happened so much, sets him in a corner, says, stay there, don't move. But he's got the bird on the shoulder, the ogre there, and just as he's putting the little ogre in the corner, he turns around only to see a 7-foot suit of armor that also dwells in Joe's house. A 7-foot suit of armor with a giant sword that is now standing in front of his friend Emmet. He is standing there and won't let him quite get to the table, And so Emmet's standing there kind of walking toward the table. This giant suit of armor is right in front of him with a giant sword. Joe runs over. He grabs, Emmet, and he's like, hey man, let's go. This is your seat right over here. Walks him around the giant suit of armor, sets him down at the table with his lovely family. But there's something else now sitting at the table as well, and it is the ugliest hag you have ever seen. I am not talking about Joe's wife. I'm actually talking about another woman that is sitting there who has a nose that looks kind of like a banana that's coming out, and when she turns, she kind of hits everyone in the room. So when she turns, she hits her wife, hits Joe, and she's got fingers that are 7 inches long with nails that have never been cut. She's filthy dirty, matted gray hair, super tiny, super skinny, and dressed completely inappropriately. And here's the worst part about this hag. Every single time she takes a bite of food, she throws it up on the table. I mean, this is a scene. And Joe's there just trying to start conversation. Hey, how's the food? And Emmet's like, it's great. It's good to see you guys. His wife and him are making small talk. The kids are kind of eating, but there's a woman vomiting out of the table. There is a giant suit of armor that is now standing behind Emmet, standing there stoic with its sword. There's a little ogre in the corner. And have we forgotten about the bird that's 3 foot tall with the matted black feathers is still sitting on Joe's shoulders, insulting him. This is a scene, but it then gets worse. Literally in the basement of Joe's house is a giant, and the door was left open, and out of nowhere, a giant arm reaches out and a shoulder out of the basement grabs his friend Emmet from the table and swallows him whole. Swallows him whole. Well, now, Joe doesn't know what to do. He runs up, goes down into the basement, punches the giant in the stomach, punches him, just Doesn't know what else to do. Like a little kid just beating on somebody's stomach. Well, the giant in the basement throws him up. He's back at the table, covered in slime. Emmet is just covered in slime. Can you imagine the scene? The old hag throwing up, knocking things over with her nose and her long fingers, the bird on the shoulder, the ogre in the corner, the suit of armor that is standing behind Emmet with the giant's sword. Joe has now locked the giant in the basement. There's a big bolt on the door. He's stuck down there, but his friend is covered in slime. They're trying to have a conversation. He just wants to say church, just wants to say Jesus, and he can't get anything out of his mouth except for, I hope you had a nice time. Emmet said, I did. He gets up and Emmet leaves the house, and then Joe sits down on the couch completely broken that this night was a disaster of ultimate proportion. And as he's sitting there, he has a few thoughts, but first, there's something you should know. There's actually a few things you should know about these creatures that live in Joe's house. First of all, they didn't start that big. They started out very small, and actually Joe met them when he was a kid. He met them when they were almost little pets. They were kind of cute. They were great companions to him. They were great friends. And so he fed them. And then what he found out is they needed to be fed a lot. So he started feeding them every day, lots and lots and lots of food. They had to be continually fed, and they always wanted more, and they always seemed hungry. And so he had to keep feeding them in order to keep them around, because they kind of tended to trail off if you didn't feed them. So he kept feeding them because he needed them close. They kind of felt like they were the only ones that understood him. But there's something else you really do need to know about the creatures that live in Joe's house, and that is they're all invisible. Nobody else can see them but Joe. Joe's the only one who can see them. And there's a third thing you should know, that each one of these creatures has a name. It came with a name when he met them in childhood. That big bird that's sitting on his shoulder, his name is Insecurity. And that little ogre that kicks everyone that comes into Joe's life, his name is Fear. And that suit of armor that showed up, that stood in the way of his friend Emmet, his name is Pride. And that old hag that's throwing up at the table, her name is Doubt. And that giant that he keeps locked in the basement, his name is Shame. And as Joe sat there on the couch, he had an epiphany that night. He got a little perspective change. And he started looking around the room, and he looked at his kids and noticed that their knees had bruises on them from being kicked by Fear. And he looked at his wife, and she was covered with some of the slime from the inside of the giant that lived in the basement. And then he looked down at his own shins, and they were more bruised than anyone else's. And he was covered in more slime than anyone else. And that suit of armor is standing as close as it possibly can to him. And Joe just wept. He wept and wept. And he thought, what am I supposed to do? And it was said, from that day forward, that every one of those creatures began to starve to death. So there's only one question left. Now that you've heard the story, what are you